Hello, friends. Welcome back to Align Vitality. Before we dive into today's episode, if you haven't listened to last week's episode, I want to encourage you to go back and start there. We opened a series called The Weight of the Chair last week by talking about the loneliness that lives inside of leadership. Not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of being surrounded and still somewhat separate and alone. If that resonated with you, I think today's episode is going to land even more deeply, because today we are talking about another thing that people don't often warn us about, and that is the anxiety, the specific low-grade, sometimes acute, hard-to-shake anxiety that comes with being in a leadership role. The anxiety that lives in the body even when the mind knows that everything is technically okay. The anxiety that shows up at 3 a.m. as a spinning list of everything you're responsible for, that arrives on Sunday evenings before a full week, that settles into your chest in the minutes before a hard conversation, that follows you home from work and sits at the dinner table with you even when you have physically left the building. That anxiety. The anxiety that is in so many ways simply the emotional signature of leading well. Because here's what I've come to understand, at least for myself, after nearly 3 decades in healthcare, 19 years of that in leadership, and a whole lot of personal reckoning with my own nervous system. And that is that anxiety is not necessarily evidence that you're doing it wrong. In many ways, it's evidence that you care deeply about doing it right. And when you understand what's actually happening in your body when that anxiety shows up, when you have a clinical picture to hold alongside that experience, something shifts a bit. The anxiety doesn't necessarily go away, but it stops being a sign that something is wrong with you. So today, let's look at what your nervous system is actually doing, and let's talk about what to do with it. Do you want to recharge your energy, restore your mental clarity, and finally feel like yourself again? Well, you are in the right place. Welcome to Align Vitality, the podcast that offers faith and functional health strategies for high-achieving, health-conscious women in midlife who want to heal from chronic stress, body and spirit. I'm your host, Tanya Engesether, a certified functional health practitioner, Christian life coach, and fellow midlife woman who knows what it's like to look strong on the outside while struggling silently on the inside. Here, we get real about anxiety, brain fog, burnout, hormone shifts, and the hidden toll of chronic stress. And more importantly, we talk about the path to healing. Each week, you'll find practical strategies and faith-fueled encouragement to help you restore your God-given energy, calm your nervous system, and reclaim peace in this season of life. If you're ready to stop pushing through and start thriving in the abundant life you were created for, let's get after it. This is Align Vitality. Let me start by saying this: not all anxiety is the same. The anxiety of leadership is not necessarily identical to the anxiety that comes from a health scare or a financial crisis or a relational problem. It has some shared physiology, which we will get into, but the shape of it is different and specific. And I think naming that is part of what makes it possible to address that. So what makes leadership anxiety particular? Well, it's the anxiety of being responsible for outcomes that you cannot fully control. You can make good decisions, you can build good systems, you can hire good people, cultivate good culture, communicate clearly, lead with integrity, and things can still go sideways. People can still be hurt. Outcomes can still disappoint people. Because leadership involves human beings, and human beings are gloriously, maddeningly unpredictable. And the leader who genuinely cares, who is in the role because she wants to make a difference, not just because she wants the title, feels that weight very acutely. She lies awake asking, did I handle that right? Did I miss something? What's going to happen to the people I'm responsible for if this doesn't go the way that I hope? That's not anxiety that's born from weakness. That is anxiety born from caring. Leadership anxiety is the anxiety of sustained visibility. When you're in a leadership role, you're watched consistently, whether you want to be or not. Your tone in a meeting sets the emotional temperature for everyone in the room. Your facial expression when you receive bad news is read and interpreted and discussed by the room, usually after you leave. The way you handle a hard moment under pressure is observed and remembered. That sustained visibility is a particular kind of pressure that most people who have not led from that seat don't fully understand. And it creates this low-grade hypervigilance, a constant background monitoring of how you're coming across, how your words are landing, whether you're getting it right in the eyes of the people watching you. That is exhausting, and it is anxiety-producing in a very specific way. Leadership anxiety is the anxiety of the gap between what you know and what you can share. We talked about this in the last episode, the loneliness episode, the information asymmetry that comes with leadership, the things you know that others don't, the decisions being processed that you can't yet discuss. But I want to name the anxiety dimension of that experience specifically because carrying knowledge that affects people you care about without being able to share it creates a particular kind of internal tension that has a real physiological cost. The body knows that something is being held onto, and the body responds to that holding. Leadership anxiety is the anxiety of never quite being off. Most leaders, especially high-capacity women who carry leadership both professionally and personally, do not have a very clean off switch. The thinking continues, the processing continues, the responsibility continues at the dinner table, in the shower, on the drive to the grocery store, at 3 a.m. when you wake up to use the bathroom. The mind rehearses upcoming conversations. It replays recent ones. It scans for what might be coming. It calculates what needs to happen next. There's a term in psychology called perseverative cognition, the tendency of the mind to return repeatedly to unresolved stressors. For leaders, the stressors are rarely fully resolved, which means the mind rarely fully stops. And a mind that never fully stops is a nervous system that never fully rests. Now, let me bring in the clinical picture, because when you understand what your nervous system is doing, when you can say, oh, this is a cortisol response, or this is my amygdala doing its job, this is what happens to a body that is carrying sustained responsibility. The anxiety loses a little bit of its power over you. It becomes something you can understand and work with rather than something that is simply happening to you. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the amygdala, your brain's alarm system. Deep in the brain sits a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. Its primary job is threat detection. It is constantly scanning the environment, whether that's physical, social, or emotional environment, for anything that signals danger. And here's the critical thing to understand. The amygdala cannot reliably distinguish between a physical threat and a psychological one. The fear response it triggers in response to a lion is physiologically very similar to the fear response it triggers in response to a high-stakes leadership decision, or a team conflict that is escalating, or the anticipation of a difficult conversation, or the Sunday night scaries, the dread of a complicated week ahead. To the amygdala, perceived threat is threat, full stop. And when the amygdala fires, which it does repeatedly, in the course of the normal day of a leader, it activates the body's full stress response machinery. So then we have the HPA axis. We've talked about this. We've talked about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis many times, including in the most recent series before this one, the Dying to Please series. But let me revisit it here in the specific context of leadership because the picture is slightly different. When the amygdala detects threat, a hard decision looming, a conflict to navigate, a performance review to give, an organizational uncertainty to hold on to, it signals the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus activates the pituitary gland. The pituitary signals the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands release cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate increases, your breath quickens, blood flow is redirected toward your muscles and away from your digestive system. Your prefrontal cortex, the rational, thoughtful, measured part of your brain, becomes partially suppressed because in a genuine emergency, you need to react, not deliberate. This is your body preparing you to respond to a threat. In an acute, short-term, genuine emergency, this is a gift and a beautiful design. This response is what kept our ancestors alive, literally. Now, in leadership, where the threats are rarely physical, they're rarely resolved quickly, and they're essentially continuous, this response becomes a problem because the body was designed to activate the stress response and then return to baseline. So, fight or flee and then rest and recover. What it was not designed for is this sustained, chronic, never quite resolving kind of stress of a leadership role. The stress that does not have a clear endpoint. The threat cannot be outrun because it is inherent to the role itself. And when that stress is chronic, when the HPA axis is firing repeatedly over weeks and months and years, the same cascade that was designed to protect you begins to work against you. Now let's talk about the prefrontal cortex. This is the piece I want to spend a moment on because I think it explains something a lot of people experience. The prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive function, of nuanced decision making, of the ability to hold complexity, consider multiple perspectives, regulate emotional responses, and think clearly under pressure. It is also, not coincidentally, the part of the brain most suppressed by acute stress, which means that in moments when leadership most demands your clearest thinking, the moments of high stakes, high pressure, high visibility, your neurochemistry is actually working against your best cognition. So this is often why we sometimes look back on a reactive moment and think, that was not my best self. Why did I handle it that way? Because in that moment of heightened stress, the prefrontal cortex was partially offline, and a more primitive, reactive part of the brain was running the show. That's just plain neuroscience, and understanding it changes the way we approach our most anxious leadership moments because it tells us that the first priority in a high anxiety situation is not to think harder, it is to regulate first, to get the nervous system out of the acute stress response before we try to access our best wisdom. We will come back to that a little bit more practically. Now, the body does keep score. Anxiety does not live only in the mind, it lives in the body. The tight chest, the shallow breathing, the shoulders that are permanently elevated toward your ears, the jaw that is clenched without you noticing, the gut that is unsettled even when you can't identify a specific reason, the sleep that is happening but it's not very restorative. These are not imaginary symptoms. They are the somatic signature of a nervous system that has been carrying sustained activation, and it's begun to hold the stress in the tissue of the body itself. Because anxiety lives in the body, it does not respond primarily to just cognitive interventions. So you can't really think your way out of a body that is in stress response. You can reframe, and journaling certainly helps. Good theology very much matters, but none of those things will fully discharge the anxiety that has taken up residence in your shoulders and your chest and your gut until you address it in the body itself. Now, I want to stop here for a moment because before we get to strategies, we need to do something that I think the leadership world does not do nearly enough. I want to normalize what you're experiencing. Here's what I notice in the leadership conversations I've been privileged to be part of, in coaching, in the clinical setting, in rooms where leaders are willing to be honest about their inner experiences. Most leaders carry their anxiety as kind of a private shame. They manage it, they push through it, they perform confidence over the top of it. They tell themselves that they should be further along, that a more seasoned leader, a more spiritually mature leader, a more capable leader would not feel this way. And that internal narrative, the shame added on top of the anxiety, is often more damaging than the anxiety itself. Let me say this clearly. The anxiety you feel is not evidence of inadequacy. It is the natural, predictable, neurologically inevitable response to carrying genuine responsibility for outcomes and people that matter very much to you. It would be more concerning in some ways if you didn't feel it. The leader who feels no anxiety is often the leader who has stopped caring, who has numbed out, checked out, or insulated herself so thoroughly from the weight of the role that she cannot feel its gravity. The anxiety, in a strange way, is a sign of your engagement, of your investment, of the fact that what you're doing matters to you and that you understand the stakes. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be understood and tended and worked with wisely. Now I want to work something in here from our Dying to Please series, because for many women in leadership, the anxiety we've been describing has an additional layer underneath it that is worth talking about. The anxiety of leadership is pretty real and fairly universal. Most leaders feel some version of it sometimes, but for women who carry a significant people-pleasing pattern, women whose nervous systems are organized around the need for approval, around managing how they're perceived, around the fear of disappointing people, leadership anxiety is particularly amplified. Because now the stakes of disappointing someone are not just personal, they're organizational. The team is watching, the board is evaluating, the patients, the clients, maybe the congregation or the community. They're all forming opinions about you and your leadership. And for those of us whose nervous system experiences disapproval as a genuine threat, all of that visibility isn't just pressure, it is continuous, low-grade alarm of threat. The hypervigilance we talked about in the people-pleasing conversation, that constant scanning, is that scanning for, is everyone okay? Is someone upset? Is something about to go wrong? It gets supercharged in a leadership role because now there are more people to monitor, more opinions to manage, more opportunities to disappoint or fall short or not be enough. And the anxiety that results is not just leadership anxiety. It is the intersection of leadership anxiety and the unaddressed wound underneath the people-pleasing pattern. Now, I'm not saying this to layer even more shame onto an already heavy experience. I say it because I think talking about it is part of what makes it possible to address at the actual root rather than managing the surface symptom of anxiety while the driver underneath continues unchecked. If you hear yourself in that description, if the leadership anxiety you carry feels somehow bigger than the roles should explain, it may be worth exploring what is underneath it. Now let's talk a little bit from a faith lens. I want to go to Philippians chapter 4 because it is one of the most quoted scriptures in conversations about anxiety and maybe one of the most misapplied. Verse 6 and 7 say, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Now, I grew up hearing this verse quoted over and over, and I almost interpreted it as more of a correction, as a prescription, as a gentle but firm reminder that if I were doing my faith right, I would not be anxious. And for a long time, that sort of framing added a bit of shame to anxiety rather than relieving it. Because I was anxious and I was praying, and the peace did not always arrive on the schedule that I expected. And I sort of concluded that something was wrong with my faith. But I want to offer a different reading of this passage, one that I think is more theologically accurate and more clinically true. The instruction is not stop being anxious, as if anxiety is simply a choice that a sufficiently faithful person would not make. The instruction is, in the anxiety, bring it to God specifically, with gratitude for what is already true, and trust that His peace, the kind that does not depend on circumstances resolving the way you hoped, will guard what is most vulnerable in you. That's a practice, not a platitude, and the practice has several components that I think are worth naming explicitly. Number one, specificity matters. Paul says, present your requests, plural, specific. Not a general, God, please help me with everything sort of request, but a, God, I am walking into a conversation tomorrow that I'm dreading. Here's what I'm afraid of. Here's what I'm carrying. Here's what I cannot control. I am putting this in your hands specifically. Specific prayer is not just spiritually more honest, it is neurologically more effective. The act of naming specific fears and worries activates the prefrontal cortex and begins to regulate the amygdala's threat response. Specificity brings the thinking brain back online. Number two, thanksgiving is not denial. The instruction to bring requests with thanksgiving is not an instruction to pretend that everything's fine. It's an invitation to hold anxiety and gratitude simultaneously, to acknowledge the hard thing while also acknowledging what is true and good and already held. That dual awareness practice, holding difficulty alongside gratitude, is one of the most clinically validating emotional regulation strategies that exists. And Paul knew it 2,000 years before neuroscience confirmed it. The peace that transcends understanding is not always the peace that resolves circumstances. That is the part I had to learn the hard way. The peace that God promises is not the absence of difficulty. It's not the resolution of every problem on my time frame. It is a settled groundedness that does not depend on outcomes going the way I want it. That kind of peace guards the heart and the mind, meaning it protects the places most vulnerable to anxiety, not by removing the threat, but by anchoring you in something more solid than the threat. That's a daily, specific, return again and again kind of practice. And it works, not because it's magic, but because it engages the nervous system's own regulatory capacity through the mechanisms that God built into us. So now let's talk about the things that I actually do, my own personal strategies, because this is the part of the series where I pull back the curtain on what I actually do, not the theory, not the best practices, but what Tanya Engesether actually does when the anxiety that comes with the seat gets very loud. First and most often, I breathe. When I notice anxiety rising, when I feel the chest tightening, the breath getting shallow, the mind starting to spin, the first thing I do is not cognitive, it is physiological. I use breathing techniques to calm my nervous system. Techniques like box breathing, reciprocal nasal breathing, or something called the physiological sigh. The physiological sigh is 2 consecutive inhales through your nose. The second one shorter, almost a quick sniff on top of the first, followed by a long, slow exhale through the mouth. And it works best if you actually kind of make a noise with the exhale, like huh. So it's huh. Stanford neuroscience Andrew Huberman has written extensively about this practice. It is the fastest known way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, to manually shift the body out of stress response and into regulation. One or two of these done intentionally can measurably change the physiological state within seconds. I do this before hard conversations, before difficult meetings. Sometimes when I wake up early in the morning and my mind is spinning, it's not very glamorous, but it is quite effective. Another thing I do is I pray Philippians chapter 4, not reciting the verse, but using it as a template. I sit down, or sometimes it's while I'm driving because that's just real life, and I name the specific things that I'm carrying. Out loud, I say, God, this is what I'm anxious about. This specifically, this is what I cannot control. This is what I'm afraid of. I'm choosing to put this in your hands, and I'm choosing to remember what is also true, what you've already done, what you've already carried, what I already know about you that does not change based on how this turns out. That practice, specific, honest, combined with intentional gratitude, is the single most consistently helpful thing in my toolkit. I've told you before, the faith component of my healing is truly the component that has been the saving, literally the saving grace, the saving tool, the thing that makes everything else possible. Another thing I do is I move. When anxiety is high and the thinking is spinning, my instinct is often to sit down and try to think my way through it, to plan, to strategize, to figure it out. But what I've learned that often movement needs to come first, whenever possible. A walk outside without headphones, paying attention to what I can see and hear and feel, shifts my neurological state in a way that no amount of sitting and thinking can. The movement completes what neuroscientist and author Bessel van der Kolk calls the stress cycle. It gives the body the physical outlet that the stress response was designed to trigger, and allows the nervous system to begin returning to baseline. And truly, during and after the walk, my thinking is clearer, my decisions are better, my access to the wisdom and groundedness I actually have is fuller. Movement first, thinking second. Sometimes I have to actually write or think through worst case scenario, and then I have to think through or write what is actually true. So this is a practice that I've stumbled into and I've had to use often ever since. When the anxious thoughts are spinning, when the catastrophizing is loud, I write down the worst case scenario. When I can't write, I just try to talk myself through it completely. The worst possible outcome of the thing that I'm most afraid of. And then I think about or write or say what is actually true, what is probable rather than possible, what I know rather than what I fear, what God has already said or done rather than what my anxiety is predicting. That contrast, catastrophe on the left, reality on the right, is remarkably grounding. It doesn't dismiss the fear, but it does contextualize it. Now, from a functional health standpoint, for a nervous system that's carrying sustained activation and for a brain that is depleted by chronic stress, targeted nutritional support matters a great deal. And the support needs differ individual by individual. A couple of things that I have found work very well to support my sleep and reduce my anxiety are the amino acids L-tryptophan and GABA taken in the evening before bed. Now again, you have to do your research and speak to someone who understands all the things to consider in terms of what might be right for you, what's going on in your functional lab results. Before you start just throwing supplements at anything, I advise you don't do that. It's never good. I'm just saying, knowing my picture, the medications I take, kind of the things that I've seen on my functional lab results. These are a couple of cost-effective, natural things, amino acids, really building blocks of what our body is supposed to already be using. I take these to help with my anxiety and my sleep. I always recommend working with someone who understands functional health before adding supplements, because the right support depends on what's actually happening in your specific biochemistry. But targeted nutritional support can be a very meaningful piece of the picture, but it works best on top of a firm foundation of faith, a healthy diet, restorative sleep, regular exercise, and stress reduction practices. Another thing that I do is I call someone who gets it. We talked about this in the loneliness episode, the importance of peer relationships with people who understand the weight from their own chair. When the anxiety's high, I have one or two people I can call and say, I'm really in it right now. I don't need advice. I just need to say it out loud to someone who understands. The co-regulation that happens in genuine, safe peer connection, where the other person's hopefully more regulated nervous system helps bring mine down, is one of the most powerful tools available to us. We weren't designed to live and lead alone. We were designed to be in and regulate ourselves in relationship. Now, before I close, I want to say something important. While it's extremely uncomfortable, sometimes incapacitating, sometimes anxiety is information. Sometimes the anxiety that will not quiet down is your body's way of telling you that something in the environment genuinely needs attention. A culture that's not healthy, a role that maybe isn't the right fit, a situation that requires action rather than regulation. The skill of leadership and the skill of self-knowledge involves learning to distinguish between anxiety that is simply the weight of the role and anxiety that is your own wisdom trying to get your attention. Regulation helps with both, because a regulated nervous system can access discernment in a way that a dysregulated one cannot. But after you have regulated yourself, after the physiological sigh and the walk and the prayer, if the anxiety is still there, still specific, still pointing at something very particular, it may be worth listening to. Your body's not always catastrophizing. Sometimes it is prophetic. Let's just close with a prayer together. God, we come to you today carrying the anxiety that comes with leading, the specific, sometimes wordless weight of being responsible for outcomes and people that matter deeply to us. We confess that we have sometimes carried this shame as evidence of inadequacy, as proof that our faith is not strong enough, and as a private failing that we've been hiding from everyone else around us. And we ask you to reframe it. Help us to see the anxiety not as a defect, but as information, not as failure, but as feeling, not as evidence that we're doing it wrong, but as the natural consequence of caring deeply about doing it right. We bring to you specifically now in this moment the things that we are most anxious about, the decisions pending, the conversations looming, the outcomes we can't control, the people we're responsible for, the weight of the seat that we're sitting in. We put them all into your hands, not because we're pretending they're not heavy, but because your hands are stronger than ours. And we receive even now the peace that does not depend on circumstances resolving the way we hope, the peace that transcends understanding, the peace that guards our hearts and our minds when the anxiety gets so loud. Thank you, Lord, for being in the chair with us. In Jesus' name, amen. Friends, the anxiety that comes with this leadership seat is real. It is physiologically real. It is emotionally real. It is the inevitable companion of carrying genuine responsibility for things and people that matter. And it doesn't mean that something's wrong with you. It means you're in the chair, doing the work, caring about it. Next week, we're going to talk about the experience of carrying things you cannot always share with everyone, the weight of confidentiality, of decisions held alone, of the professional isolation that comes with authority. That one's close to home, and I think it's going to resonate. And until next time, lead well, live well, and be well. Thank you so much for joining me today, my friend. If today's episode encouraged or blessed you, would you please take a minute to leave a rating and written review on Apple Podcasts? It means the world to me, and it helps more women like you discover this message of hope and healing. If you're ready to take the next step in your functional health journey, join my interest list at alignvitalityhealth.com. And remember, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be medical advice, nor is it intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please consult your healthcare provider before making changes to your health. Until next time, I'm Tanya Engesether, reminding you that healing is possible and your best season is still ahead.